Kieran Holt had never intended to be in the middle of a fight, especially not on a station as dangerous as Vesker 9, a well-known hub for traders, smugglers, and all kinds of shady characters. The station wasn't the kind of place to make a name for yourself by getting into bar brawls. But there he was, standing face to face with a massive alien in the Red Sun Tavern, trying to keep his cool. The alien, who towered over Kieran with dark green skin and a sharp, angular face, was called HFY, a prince from the Vorun Dominion, a terrifying empire of warriors known across the galaxy. Zelfor had been talking down to Kieran and anyone else who would listen, boasting about the superiority of the Vorun race and mocking humans like they were nothing. Kieran wasn't one to take insults lightly. When Zelfor shoved a glass of space whiskey into his chest, the small spark of anger Kieran had been holding back turned into a flame. He grabbed the alien by the wrist, spun him around, and landed a solid punch to Zelfor's jaw. What happened next was fast and brutal. Zelfor swung back with the force of a freight ship, but Kieran was quicker. He ducked under the blow, countered with an uppercut, and sent the alien stumbling back. The bar went dead silent, all eyes on them as the two men faced off. Kieran knew he was at a disadvantage. Zelfor's strength was legendary, but he wasn't about to back down. The whole bar had seen it. A human, no bigger than a regular man, was giving the Vorun prince a run for his money. The fight spilled out of the tavern and into the dimly lit alley, a blur of fists and flashing lights as Kieran used his agility to stay a step ahead. For every heavy punch Zelfor landed, Kieran was able to dodge, counter, and hit back harder. It didn't take long for the alien prince to lose his footing, crashing to the ground, stunned and humiliated. The moment was surreal. Kieran stood over Zelfor, panting, as the alien struggled to rise. There was a brief silence in the air, and then everything changed. As Zelfor groggily got to his feet, he glared at Kieran, but instead of rage, there was something else in his eyes, something dangerous, as though he had just realized the weight of the situation. Kieran didn't know what was going on, but before he could react, a group of Zelfor's personal guards surrounded him, weapons drawn. He tensed, but before he could do anything foolish, a smooth, commanding voice cut through the air. "You have dishonored my husband." A figure stepped forward from the shadows. Vezera, the princess of Vorun. She was tall, dressed in a flowing, shimmering armor that gleamed under the station's artificial lights. Her piercing eyes locked onto Kieran, and for a brief moment, he couldn't help but feel a surge of admiration. She wasn't just a noblewoman. She was a warrior in her own right, known for her battle prowess and intelligence. But it wasn't admiration that filled the air. It was tension. "You've beaten him in public, human," she continued, her voice calm but cold. "According to Vorun tradition, that means you are now his replacement." Kieran blinked. Replacement. He was too stunned to understand what she was talking about. But before he could speak, a thick silence fell over the scene. The guards and Vezera stood still, waiting for Kieran to say something. Anything. He looked at her, then back to Zelfor, who was now scowling at the ground, blood dripping from his lip. "Hold up," Kieran said, shaking his head. "I didn't sign up for any of this. I just punched him because he was talking trash." Vezera didn't blink. "You defeated him in battle. It is law in the Vorun Dominion that when a man is bested in combat, his opponent must marry his bride." She took a step forward, her gaze never leaving Kieran's. "Congratulations, you are now my husband." Kieran's mind spun. Marry her? He could barely process what she was saying. He looked at the princess, then at the guards, then back to Zelfor, who seemed just as confused as he was. But one thing was crystal clear. Kieran was in over his head, and the last thing he wanted was to be entangled in alien politics or some strange royal tradition. But there was no turning back now. Kieran couldn't believe what he was hearing. The words, "You are now my husband," echoed in his mind, As Vezera stepped closer, her eyes locked on his with a mixture of cold detachment and something else he couldn't quite read. The idea of marrying this fierce, otherworldly woman after beating her husband in a fight was beyond absurd, but before he could protest, her guard stepped forward, grabbing his arms with an iron grip. "Hey, wait a minute. I didn't ask for any of this," Karen shouted, struggling against their hold, but it was useless. The guards were as strong as they looked. Vezora didn't even flinch as Karen was dragged to his feet. "You've already made your choice, human," she said, her voice calm and unwavering. "In the eyes of the Varun, you've defeated XL4. That means you must now take his place as my husband." She seemed so sure of herself, like this was just another formality in her life. But Karen was freaking out. This wasn't some alien tradition he'd signed up for. He had just wanted a drink and to mind his own business. Now his life had turned into a galactic soap opera, and he didn't even know how to escape. The guards marched him through the winding corridors of the station, ignoring his protests. Karen tried to twist and turn, searching for a way out, but every door was locked or blocked by more guards. His head was spinning. He had just accidentally defeated a warlord's husband, and now he was supposed to marry a princess of an empire. A warlike empire, no less. There was no way out, no escape. They arrived at a large room deep within the Dominion's embassy on Veskar 9. The room was luxurious, filled with soft, glowing lights and smooth alien architecture that made Kieran feel like a fish out of water. He was thrown into a seat, still trying to catch his breath. Vezera stood across from him, watching him carefully. "You must understand, this is not about love or choice," she said, her voice suddenly softer. "This is about duty. It's about maintaining the honor of my people. In the Vorun Dominion, the laws of combat are absolute. When a man loses in battle, his wife is bound to his victor. It is our way." Kieran stared at her, his mind racing. "This is crazy," he muttered. "I don't know the first thing about being married, especially not to someone like you." Vezera raised an eyebrow. "And yet here we are," she replied, unfazed. "You will learn. The marriage is not just ceremonial. It is political. As my husband, you will gain power in the Dominion. You will have the chance to reshape things, to guide the people of my world." Kieran was taken aback. He had never been much for politics, much less ruling an entire empire. Wait, hold on. I'm just a salvager. I don't want to lead an empire. I don't even know how to fly a spaceship properly." Vezera smirked at him, as if amused by his panic. "Your human mind works differently. I can see that. You are unpredictable, adaptable. That makes you valuable in ways you don't understand." She paused for a moment, and her expression grew serious. "But be warned, Kieran Holt. The Varun are a proud and ancient race. We value strength above all. If you fail to prove yourself, there will be consequences. The throne is not given freely, even to a victorious husband." Kieran swallowed. He wasn't sure what kind of game she was playing. But he wasn't about to let this alien princess, who seemed as deadly as she was beautiful, manipulate him into becoming some kind of figurehead for her empire. He wasn't interested in ruling galaxies or fighting their wars. He just wanted to get out of this mess alive. "I didn't ask for any of this," Kieran said again, trying to steady his nerves. "I didn't even want to fight XL4. This whole thing is insane." Vezera's eyes softened for a brief moment, but then the coldness returned. "Sometimes fate chooses you, whether you want it or not," she said, her voice hardening once more. "This is not a choice, Kieran Holt. You have made your mark on the Varun, and now you will live with the consequences." The weight of her words hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Kieran didn't know what to do next, but one thing was for sure. He was in deeper than he had ever imagined. He might have accidentally knocked out her husband, but now he had to figure out how to survive in a universe where even the smallest mistake could lead to death, or a galactic marriage to a powerful, unpredictable princess. Karen wasn't sure which was worse. Karen couldn't believe how quickly his life had spiraled out of control. Just a few days ago, he was a regular salvager, hunting for valuable scrap on Vesker 9. Now he was being dragged into the heart of the Varun Dominion, a place where political alliances were more dangerous than a ship full of bombs. And as if that wasn't enough, the wedding was fast approaching. His wedding to Vezera, the princess of the Dominion. He had no clue what to expect from a royal wedding, but he was pretty sure it wasn't going to be like anything he had ever imagined. The day of the wedding arrived, and Karen found himself standing on the balcony of a massive, towering palace, looking out at the sprawling city of Varun Prime. The city was unlike anything he had ever seen. Towering spires reached up toward the stars, and the streets below buzzed with activity. Alien markets, strange crafts, and powerful military ships flying overhead. Karen could barely wrap his mind around it all. He felt like a tiny speck in a galaxy far too big for him to handle. Vezera stood beside him, her presence commanding as always. She was dressed in an elaborate gown made from shimmering materials Karen couldn't identify, her eyes focused on the horizon. She wasn't wearing the armor he was used to seeing her in. This was something different, something more ceremonial. She looked like a queen, strong, proud, and untouchable. "You'll need to behave," she said, her voice smooth but stern. "There's more to this wedding than you realize, Karen. The entire Dominion is watching us. We must show strength, unity." She paused, glancing at him. "That includes you." Karen was still having trouble believing he was even here, let alone supposed to marry the princess of a ruthless alien empire. "I don't even know what half of this means," he muttered under his breath. "You'll learn," she replied, her tone unbothered, as if it didn't matter whether he understood or not. As they made their way into the grand hall, the atmosphere became even more intense. There were thousands of guests, warriors, diplomats, and dignitaries, all watching intently as Karen and Vezera took their place at the front. The whole scene felt surreal, like some kind of dream he couldn't wake up from. He didn't belong here. But before the ceremony could begin, chaos erupted. A loud crash shattered the air, followed by a series of explosions that rocked the entire palace. Karen's heart raced as the sound of blaster fire filled the room. Vezera's expression didn't change. She grabbed his arm and pulled him toward a side exit. "They've come," she said, her voice calm, but with an edge of urgency. "The Jari death clans. They've come to disrupt the wedding." Karen didn't have time to ask who the Jari were. He just followed her through the winding halls as guards rushed past them, weapons drawn. The sound of fighting echoed through the palace, and Karen's instincts kicked in. He was no stranger to chaos, but this was on a whole different level. As they rounded a corner, a group of Jari assassins appeared in front of them. Their glowing eyes narrowed in on Vezera. One of them drew a blade, and Karen didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, throwing himself into the fray. He had no idea what he was doing, but his body acted on instinct. He tackled one of the assassins to the ground, throwing punches with everything he had. The alien's skin was tough, but Karen's rage was fiercer. He managed to knock out two of them before the others began to retreat. Vezera, standing tall beside him, didn't look impressed. She didn't even seem to care that her life had just been in danger. "Good," she said, eyeing the fallen assassins with cold precision. "But don't think that was all. The Jari will never stop coming. They want to take me down. And now that you're in my life, they'll be after you too." Karen wiped the sweat from his brow, feeling more confused than ever. "This is your wedding day, and we're being attacked by assassins. What kind of people are you?" Vezera looked at him, her face expressionless. "The kind who don't let threats like this stand in our way. Now we'll have to finish what was started. We'll go back, and the ceremony will proceed." Karen couldn't believe what he was hearing. In his wildest dreams, he never imagined his first experience with a royal wedding would involve dodging assassins and fighting for his life. But that was exactly what was happening. The Jari weren't going to let the wedding go off without a fight. And neither was Kieran. If he had to marry Vaizura to survive, then he'd fight to stay alive long enough to figure out what the hell was going on. The only thing he knew for sure was this: his life had just gone from crazy to ridiculously insane. After the assassin attack, Kieran could barely wrap his head around what was happening. It wasn't enough that he had been dragged into a royal marriage he never asked for. Now he was fighting off intergalactic assassins on his wedding day. This wasn't how he'd imagined starting a new chapter in his life. When Vaizura pulled him back into the Grand Hall, still under siege from the attackers, he could only watch as the scene shifted. There were more soldiers, more chaos, and a bunch of royals acting like everything was perfectly normal. The Dominion's elite guards were handling the Jari assassins, while the wedding ceremony continued as if nothing had happened. Vaizura, ever calm in the midst of the storm, gave Kieran a sidelong glance. "You handled yourself well," she said, "but this is only the beginning. They'll come for me again." Kieran wiped blood off his knuckles and muttered, "I didn't sign up for any of this. You're telling me this is normal for you?" The princess's gaze didn't waver. "It's part of the price of leadership. The Jari have been a thorn in our side for centuries. Their hatred for my family runs deep." Kieran tried to process the weight of her words, but the adrenaline was still coursing through his veins. He wanted to scream, to run away, but Vaizura was right. He couldn't escape. Not now. Not after everything he'd been dragged into. As the last of the assassins were cleared from the palace, Vaizura turned to Kieran. The ceremony was back on track, and the attendants were already making preparations. They moved with military precision, oblivious to the earlier violence that had taken place. He glanced around, his eyes settling on a crowd of dignitaries and military leaders who were now murmuring amongst themselves. A mixture of fear and curiosity hung in the air. The Jari attack had shaken them all, but their eyes also lingered on Kieran. The human who defeated Selfar, that was what they'd be calling him from now on. Not just some random salvage guy anymore. Suddenly, Vaizura's voice snapped him back to reality. "You're going to have to be more than just a figurehead, Kieran. These people aren't here to see a human play dress-up. They want power, control, and strength. You'll need to convince them that you belong here, that you have the strength to lead." Kieran swallowed hard. "You're telling me I have to lead this entire place?" "Not the whole Dominion," she replied smoothly. "But they'll be watching you. They'll judge how you behave. Your actions will speak louder than words. If you fail, the consequences will be severe." Kieran took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what he was expecting out of this whole marriage arrangement, but it wasn't to be shoved into the center of an intergalactic political game. It felt like a setup. A dangerous game where he was the pawn, and everyone else was playing for keeps. But he didn't have the luxury of backing out now, not without risking everything. As the wedding ceremony began, Kieran stood beside Vaizura, trying to calm his nerves. The palace hall was filled with rich colors and ancient symbols, symbols of power, war, and triumph. A ceremonial robe was draped over his shoulders, and though he barely understood its significance, he felt the weight of it. This was not just fabric. It was a symbol of his new status, a link to the Varun throne. The officiant, an old Varun priest, began speaking in a language Kieran couldn't understand. He could only pick up a few words, most of them sounding harsh and deep, like the growl of a distant animal. Vaizura's gaze was fixed ahead, her expression unreadable. But Kieran could feel the pressure building. This wasn't just about him and her. It was about their entire future, the future of the Dominion, and the delicate balance of power that was already hanging by a thread. Just as the ceremony reached its climax, Kieran felt a strange sensation, a tightness in his chest, as though he was being bound by invisible chains. He wasn't sure what it was: fear, doubt, or the overwhelming sense that he was trapped in something far beyond his control. The officiant's voice grew louder, and before he knew it, Vezera's cold, strong hand was placed on his. "Do you take me as your wife, Kieran Holt?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kieran looked into her eyes, the weight of the question sinking in. It wasn't just a simple yes or no. It was a pledge of loyalty, a commitment to a future he wasn't sure he wanted. But then he thought about everything that had happened. The assassins, the threats, the impossible odds. He couldn't back out now. Not if he wanted to survive. "I do," he said, his voice steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. The crowd erupted in applause, and the chains that had been tightening around him seemed to loosen just a little. But deep down, Kieran knew this was only the beginning. His life had just become a war, one he wasn't sure he was prepared to fight. Kieran barely had time to breathe before the weight of his new role began to sink in. The wedding was a blur of flashing lights and ceremonial rituals that meant nothing to him, and yet everything to the people watching. As soon as the final vows were spoken, Vezera guided him away from the grand hall, her eyes sharp and calculating as always. Kieran, still reeling from the whole experience, tried to keep up with her pace. "Now that you're my husband, Kieran Holt, your actions will speak for both of us," Vezera said, her voice steady, almost cold. "The Dominion will look to you for guidance, whether you're ready or not. And the Jari will not stop. They will try again. But they're only the beginning." Kieran's head was spinning. He had gone from a simple salvager to the husband of a princess in an alien empire in less than a week. He'd barely had time to process what had happened to him. And now he was thrust into a game of politics, survival, and endless scheming. "What do you mean by they're only the beginning?" Kieran asked, trying to keep his voice calm, though his mind was racing. The word Jari had become a constant buzz in his ears, and he had no idea how deep the rabbit hole really went. "The Jari death clans are only one faction," Vezera replied, her voice low, almost in a whisper, as they entered a private chamber deep within the palace. "The Varun Dominion is divided. There are many factions here, each with its own agenda. Some want peace, some want power, and others want chaos. Your presence as my husband makes you a target. The Jari won't be the only ones who try to use you." Kieran frowned, sitting down in the large ornate chair she had directed him toward. "What am I supposed to do? I'm just a guy who got lucky in a fight. I don't belong here." "You belong here because you won," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "In our culture, power is the currency. You defeated XL4 in single combat, and now you're seen as a potential threat, or a potential ally, depending on who's asking. The factions will test you, Kieran. They'll offer you things, try to manipulate you, pull you in their direction." Kieran leaned back, running a hand through his hair, still in disbelief. "I didn't ask for any of this. I'm not some politician. I'm not a fighter. I'm just trying to survive." Vezera gave him a cold smile. "And yet, here you are, thrust into the heart of this empire. You wanted to survive, and now you have to play the game. There's no escaping it." She paused, walking over to a large window that overlooked the vast city below. The lights of Varun Prime twinkled like stars, but it only made Kieran feel smaller. "I didn't ask for this either, Kieran, but I've learned to navigate the shadows, to survive in a world where the strong devour the weak." Kieran stood up, his frustration building. "I don't know how to navigate your empire. I don't know how to survive in this game you keep talking about. How am I supposed to figure all this out? What am I supposed to do?" Vezera turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "You'll learn quickly, or you'll die. There's no in between." She moved closer to him, her voice low and steady. "I will teach you, Kieran. I'll show you how to fight, how to think like a ruler, not a commoner." A flicker of doubt crossed Kieran's mind. He didn't trust her completely. He couldn't, but he couldn't afford to reject her offer either. She was right about one thing: there was no going back. The moment he defeated Cell 4, His life had changed forever. Now it was all about survival. "I can't do this alone," he said, his voice a mix of desperation and resolve. "I don't know what I'm doing." Vezora's cold gaze softened, just for a moment. "You don't have to do it alone. I will guide you, Kieran Holt. But you must trust me. Trust that I know this world, its people, its politics. Trust that I will help you stay alive." Kieran wasn't sure what to think. He had never been good at trusting others, especially not when it came to high-stakes games like this one. But right now, Vezora was his only ally, his only chance at making it out of this alive. And for the first time since all this started, Kieran felt a flicker of something, a strange mix of fear and determination. He wasn't sure how he was going to survive this galactic mess, but one thing was for certain. He wasn't going down without a fight. And if that meant trusting a dangerous alien princess with his life, then so be it. The next few days were a whirlwind for Kieran. No matter how much he tried to find some quiet moment to himself, Vezora's schedule never gave him a break. Every day was filled with meetings, briefings, and endless political maneuvering. Kieran found himself sitting at the royal table, listening to discussions he barely understood, surrounded by influential people from all across the galaxy. There were governors, generals, and diplomats, each one with their own hidden agenda, all trying to get on Vezora's good side, hoping to secure a future alliance. Kieran couldn't help but feel like a fish out of water. He was no diplomat, and he certainly wasn't accustomed to the delicate game of political survival that seemed to rule this alien empire. But Vezora was right. He was in it now, and he had to learn how to play the game if he wanted to stay alive. One afternoon, as they sat at the grand table surrounded by members of the ruling council, Vezora nudged him. "Listen carefully, Kieran. They're testing you now. The way you respond will show them who you are. Do not appear weak." Kieran didn't understand what she meant at first, but then he noticed the subtle glances exchanged between the council members. They were watching him, sizing him up. They were trying to figure out what kind of man he really was, and in this world, appearance was everything. A tall, silver-skinned diplomat named Vora leaned forward, his voice smooth and practiced. "Prince Kieran, it is an honor to have you among us. Your unique status as both an outsider and a royal consort is quite intriguing. I'm sure it will bring fresh perspectives to the Dominion's future." Kieran forced a smile, trying not to show how uncomfortable he felt under the diplomat's gaze. "I'm just here to learn," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "I'm not looking to change anything just yet." Vora's smile never faltered, but Kieran could see the flicker of amusement in his eyes. Of course. But surely you must have opinions, given your unique background. We are always open to new ideas." The way Vora emphasized the word unique made Kieran feel like a curiosity, an experiment that had yet to prove its worth. Kieran didn't answer right away, choosing instead to observe the others around the table. The governor of Varys IV, a woman named Lizara, was watching him carefully. Her sharp eyes betrayed no emotion, but Kieran could tell she was calculating. It was as if she were trying to determine whether he was a threat or an opportunity. Vezora noticed his hesitation and gave him a quick, silent nod. "Answer, Kieran. Show them that you understand the value of silence and diplomacy." Kieran took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I don't know much about running an empire." The room fell silent. Kieran couldn't tell if they were impressed or if they thought he was naive. But he didn't care. He'd spoken his mind, and for the first time, he felt like he had at least earned a sliver of respect. Vora raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. You speak of balance, yet you have so little experience in the complexities of ruling an empire." Kieran wasn't about to back down. Experience doesn't always mean wisdom. Sometimes, an outside perspective can offer something new. He met Vora's gaze without flinching. Vezora's lips twitched into a slight smile. She was watching him closely, and Kieran realized that she had just thrown him into the deep end, seeing if he could swim. He wasn't sure if he had passed or failed, but he wasn't going to let her down now. As the meeting continued, Kieran found himself becoming more aware of the undercurrents in the room. These weren't just discussions about the Empire's future. They were power plays, each participant trying to find a way to gain more influence over the others. And Kieran, despite his lack of experience, had just made his first move in this dangerous game. Later that evening, as they walked through the palace corridors, Vezera spoke again. "You did well. They'll remember what you said." Kieran didn't feel proud. He felt like a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. But Vezera's words gave him a sense of purpose. "I'm not here to make friends," he muttered. "I just want to survive." "You will," she replied, her tone cold but with a hint of something else. Something like approval. "But remember, survival is about more than just avoiding death. It's about understanding your enemies, reading their intentions, and never showing them weakness." Kieran nodded, the weight of her words settling on him. He had just entered a world where every decision could mean life or death. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but there was no turning back now. The political games of the Vorun Dominion had begun, and Kieran Holt had just made his first move. Whether it would keep him alive or end his life was still uncertain. But one thing was clear. He was going to play this game with everything he had. As the days passed, Kieran grew more accustomed to the palace's rhythms. The meetings, the endless discussions, the power plays. Each day felt like a battle, each conversation a calculated move in a larger game. Yet, despite the tension in the air, Kieran couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking beneath the surface, something he couldn't quite see but could definitely feel. The Dominion was vast, its power structures complex, but Kieran's gut told him that something wasn't right. Vezera had warned him of the shadows that lingered in the halls of power, and the more he observed, the more he understood. The people he thought were his allies seemed to have their own secret agendas. They smiled at him, nodded in approval, but behind those smiles was something colder. Kieran began to realize that these friendly faces were not just a part of the game. They were players, each one vying for their own slice of power. One evening, after a particularly tense council meeting, Kieran and Vezera retreated to a private balcony overlooking the sprawling city below. The stars twinkled in the distance, but the palace felt heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Vezera's expression was unreadable as she stared out into the night. "You're starting to see it, aren't you?" Kieran stood beside her, his arms crossed over his chest. "I'm starting to feel like everyone here is playing a game, and I'm the prize." He wasn't sure if it was the constant political games or the strange tension he felt from the council members, but something about the whole situation felt off. Everyone's smiling, nodding, acting like everything's fine. But there's something else going on. Something they're not telling me. Vezera's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no warmth behind it. "You're right. Everyone here is playing for power, but not all of them are as open about it as others." She paused, turning toward him. "I told you this would be hard, Kieran. The game isn't just about outsmarting your enemies. It's about surviving the ones who don't show their cards." Kieran rubbed his eyes. "I've never played a game like this before. It's all just overwhelming." "Welcome to the reality of being in the seat of power," Vezera said, her voice almost too calm. "Your every move will be watched, and those who don't show their true intentions will be the ones you need to fear most." Kieran glanced at her. "So what do we do about it? How do I survive when I don't even know who my enemies are?" Vezera turned and faced him fully, her eyes sharp. "You need to start paying attention to the things they don't say. The way they act. The little signs that tell you who's truly in control. And most importantly, you need to learn who to trust and who to cut off before they get the chance to sink their claws into you." Kieran felt a chill run down his spine. "You're telling me there are people here who would betray us?" "Not just betray," she replied, her voice low and dangerous. "They would destroy us if it meant they could take what's ours." The Jari assassins were just a glimpse of the dangers we're facing. Kieran swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had thought the Jari were the biggest threat to his survival, but now he understood that they were just a small piece of the puzzle. There were deeper, darker forces at play, ones that even Vezora couldn't predict. "And you trust me to navigate this?" Kieran asked, his voice filled with doubt. "I barely know what I'm doing here. I'm just a guy from another world." Vezora studied him for a moment before speaking. "You may not have the experience of ruling, Kieran, but you have something they don't. You have an outsider's perspective. You're not bound by the traditions that tie them down. You can think in ways they can't. That makes you dangerous, and it makes you invaluable." The silence between them stretched for a few moments before Kieran spoke again. "But how do we even begin to fight an enemy we can't see? How do we protect ourselves when we don't even know who the real threat is?" Vezora turned back to the stars. "We start small. We watch. We listen. And when the time comes, we strike. We make our own allies, and we eliminate the ones who stand in our way. Slowly, methodically. We don't rush. The game is long, Kieran, but if we play it right, we can come out on top." Kieran took a deep breath, his mind working through the possibilities. He had been thrust into a world of shadows and deceit, and he had no idea where the next move would take him. But one thing was certain. The stakes were higher than he ever could have imagined. He wasn't just a husband anymore. He was a player in a galactic game of survival, and every step he took could be his last. But if there was one thing Kieran was certain of, it was that he wouldn't go down without a fight. Not when he had Vezora on his side. Not when the galaxy itself was at stake. The next few weeks felt like a fragile truce in the midst of a brewing storm. Kieran tried to adapt to his new life, his mind constantly on edge, always looking over his shoulder. He had learned quickly that in the Dominion, nothing was ever as it seemed. Allies could be enemies, and enemies could wear the mask of friends. Vezora's teachings became his lifeline, and slowly he started to get the hang of the dangerous game they were playing. But as the days passed, Kieran began to feel an unsettling calm in the palace. There were no open threats, no visible dangers. But the tension was thick in the air, like the quiet before a storm. He could sense it in the whispers that floated through the halls, in the careful glances that were exchanged when he entered a room. It was as though everyone was waiting for something, and he had no idea what that something was. Vezora was often away, handling matters of the Empire, which left Kieran with ample time to observe the palace's inner workings. He spent his days learning the intricacies of the Dominion's politics, attending meetings, and attempting to navigate the delicate balance of power. Despite his growing understanding, he still felt like an outsider, a pawn in a game where he didn't fully know the rules. One evening, as Kieran walked through the lavish corridors of the palace, he found himself drawn to a quieter, more secluded part of the building. It was a beautiful garden, with alien flowers that glowed faintly under the moonlight. The tranquility of the place was a sharp contrast to the chaos that seemed to pulse just beneath the surface of the palace. Kieran sat down on a stone bench, allowing himself a rare moment of peace. He leaned back, trying to relax, when a familiar voice broke the silence. "You look like you're plotting something, Kieran Holt." Kieran turned to find Vezora standing in the entrance to the garden, her eyes sharp as ever. Despite the calmness of her tone, there was an unreadable expression on her face. Kieran knew better than to underestimate her. She was always watching, always calculating. "Just thinking," Kieran said, his voice careful. "About everything. How does all of this work? How do we figure out who we can trust?" Vezora walked toward him, her gaze scanning the garden before settling on him. "You trust no one until they prove themselves," she replied, her tone flat. "Even those closest to you can have their own agendas. Especially here. It's the nature of power. Everyone wants something." Kieran frowned, his thoughts racing. He had always been someone who relied on instinct, someone who trusted people, at least he used to. Now, in this foreign world of politics, he didn't know who he could trust. It was unnerving, knowing that even those who appeared to have his best interests at heart might be plotting against him. "You're right," he muttered. "But it's exhausting, living like this. I feel like I'm always looking over my shoulder." Vezura's expression softened for a moment, though her eyes remained sharp. "You will get used to it. This is the price of power, Kirin. The moment you step into this world, you are never truly free of it. The ones who survive learn to live in the shadows, to walk the fine line between enemies and allies. And even then, survival is never guaranteed." Kirin let out a sigh, the weight of her words settling on him. It was clear now that survival wasn't just about fighting or winning battles. It was about understanding the unseen forces that shaped this empire. The political landscape was shifting, and Kirin could feel it in his bones. "I just don't know what we're waiting for," Kirin said, standing up from the bench. "It feels like something's coming. Something big." Vezura's gaze sharpened. "You're not wrong," she said quietly. "I've been hearing whispers too." Kirin's heart raced at her words. He had known that the peace wouldn't last, but hearing it from Vezura made it feel all the more real. There was no escaping the web of power and politics he had found himself tangled in. Every decision, every move he made from now on could tip the scales in one direction or another. And the price of failure, of being caught off guard, could mean his life. "What do we do now?" Kirin asked, his voice low but steady. Vezura looked at him, her face unreadable. "We wait for now. But we don't let our guard down. There will be no warning when the storm hits. You need to learn how to trust your instincts, Kirin. They'll be your best weapon in this game." Kirin nodded, determination settling in his chest. The storm was coming, and there was no way to stop it. All he could do now was survive it, and make sure he was ready when it did. The garden around them seemed to grow quieter, the night air thick with the promise of change. And in that silence, Kirin knew one thing for certain. The game had only just begun, and the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. The days that followed were tense, as if the very air around the palace was charged with the promise of an impending storm. Kirin couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. Vezura's warnings had sunk in, and he spent every moment observing, calculating, trying to pick up on the smallest signs of what was to come. It wasn't easy, especially when it seemed like the people around him were so skilled at hiding their true intentions. Then, one fateful evening, it all came crashing down. Kirin was summoned to a council meeting, something that wasn't unusual. What was unusual, however, was the sense of urgency in the air. As he entered the grand hall, he noticed the sharp glances exchanged between the members of the ruling council. Something was different this time. There was a quiet tension in the room, one that only deepened when he took his seat next to Vezura. The meeting began, but it was clear from the start that the usual discussions of trade routes and alliances were mere distractions. The real topic, hidden beneath the formalities, was a growing conspiracy, a plot that threatened to shake the very foundation of the Dominion. Kirin could feel his pulse quicken as he realized that the calm before the storm was finally over. "Prince Kirin," a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Lizara, the governor of Varys IV, her voice smooth, but her eyes sharp. "We have received troubling reports from the outer regions. The Jari have not been silenced, as we thought. They are growing in strength and numbers, and worse, there are whispers of other factions uniting with them, a coalition that could threaten the stability of the entire Dominion." Kirin's stomach tightened. The Jari had already proven themselves dangerous, but this was different. He could feel the weight of the council's gaze on him as the discussion turned to the next steps. Some spoke of military retaliation, others of diplomacy, but all the while, Kirin's mind raced. Vezura, who had been silent until now, leaned closer to Kirin, her voice a whisper. "The time has come, Kirin. We cannot wait any longer. The storm is here." He nodded, understanding the weight of her words. It wasn't just a matter of defending the Dominion. It was a matter of survival. He knew that the council was divided, with factions supporting different approaches, and none of them fully trusted each other. But Karen also understood that in this world of shadows, alliances were fragile, and at any moment they could fracture. "What do we do?" Karen asked, his voice barely audible. "Trust your instincts," Vezura replied, her tone firm. "You've been learning how to play this game. Now it's time to make your move. We need to act before our enemies realize how close they are to victory." The next few hours were a blur. Karen had been thrown into the heart of a political firestorm, and every decision felt like it could tip the scales one way or another. He listened, observed, and tried to anticipate the moves of those around him. The council's arguments became more heated, their alliances more evident. It was clear that they were preparing for war, but Karen knew that simply reacting to the threat would not be enough. Enough. Karen's voice rang out suddenly, cutting through the rising tension. All eyes turned to him. It was the first time he had spoken up with such authority, and the effect was immediate. He stood tall, his mind clear. The Jari are a threat, yes, but they are not the only threat. We've been playing defense for too long, waiting for them to strike. It's time we take the initiative. His words echoed through the room. We can't afford to keep waiting. We need to act now. We need to show them that we are not weak, that we won't let anyone tear this empire apart. The room was silent for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, it was Lysara who spoke first, her voice calm but filled with admiration. "Prince Kieran speaks the truth. We've been reactive for too long. It's time we show strength." Kieran's heart raced, but he didn't let it show. He had just made his first real move in this deadly game, and for the first time, he felt like he was in control. The council members began to murmur among themselves, and Kieran could sense that the tide was shifting. The quiet whispers of the factions were becoming louder, their loyalties beginning to shift in his favor. Vezura watched him closely, a rare hint of pride in her eyes. "Well done," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Kieran couldn't help but feel a surge of confidence. He had made his mark. The game was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he had a real chance to win. The storm was here, but Kieran Holt was ready. He had learned the game, and now he was ready to play it to win.